Welcome, everybody. And today we are talking about why companies should lobby for climate and how employees can help. Kevin is going to introduce our speakers, and then we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Jiang, a Dartmouth parent. Welcome. Today's session will be recorded. Here, I'm very excited to welcome ClimateVoice. And today, join us is Bill Weil and Jennifer Allen. So let me give a quick bio of both, and then I'll give you a few chance to let both have a few words before Jennifer jumps in for the presentation, followed by Q&A session with Kate. During the session, we are going to take questions under the chat box. We'll select some good questions and to ask to our speakers. So feel free to type in your questions and we'll select the good ones to present. So to start out, let me introduce Bill. And Bill Weil is a very, very exciting figure in the climate movement. And prior, he founded ClimateVoice in 2020. Bill was a green energy czar at Google, as well as a director of Facebook sustainability energy team. He also was a faculty of computer science at MIT. Next is Jennifer Allen. Jennifer is a director program campaign for ClimateVoice. Jennifer is responsible for planning and implementing strategic initiatives to push companies to go all in on climate policy. Prior working on climate, Jennifer was managing director of diversity and inclusion at PwC. She designed strategies to retain, develop, and advance women, minority, and LGBT plus professionals at the firm. Jennifer graduated from Brown University and earned a master's in public policy and Harvard Kennedy School. She's proud recipient of 2016 TED Child Life Work Excellence Award. So let me welcome both. First, Bill.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you all for inviting us to join you. You'll notice my voice is a little strained and slow. I've developed an issue with my throat. It doesn't hurt and nothing else is affected, but my voice is going about a third as fast as my brain, which is certainly frustrating for me. So please bear with me. Jennifer is going to do the prepared presentation, and then we'll both take part in the conversation after that. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks so much, Bill. And thanks everyone for having us today. So I am, as Kevin mentioned, I lead campaigns for ClimateVoice. And before that, I did diversity and inclusion at PricewaterhouseCoopers. So like Bill, I was really an insider trying to change companies and what we can do to harness companies as a force for good. So what I want to do is share with everyone just a little bit of an overview of what we do at ClimateVoice, a recent campaign that we just did around the Build Back Better Act that is still sort of being debated in Congress, though slightly stalled in the Senate. And then we really want to spend the bulk of our time talking to you and answering questions and talking about how you can raise your climate voice at work. So our mission is to mobilize the voice of the workforce to urge companies to go all in on climate policy. So basically, we define workforce as students as the talent pool. So the talent that companies are trying to recruit to come work for them, and their current employees. And the big goal that we want to solve, along with all of you who care about climate, is what we know is we have to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. And I'm sure many of you read the IPCC report and all of the incredible media coverage about the IPCC report. And every time you open a website or talk about what companies or cities or countries are doing, they're setting goals to reduce emissions sort of writ large, right? And our first big deadline is 2030. And then a lot of the goals that people are talking about are all the way out to 2050, right? And so the question is, how are we going to solve the climate crisis at scale at the speed required? And so one of the things that we really believe is that companies have an incredibly important voice in this debate, and they can help shape the ways in which we do this at scale, and that they have a real influence on lawmakers. But right now, when you talk to sustainability executives and you look at many really pro-climate companies, so companies who said, I care about climate, we want to make a difference, they're focused on reducing their own carbon footprint. So, in the jargon, people are always talking about measuring and reducing scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So that's really a company's direct emissions and then the energy that they're purchasing, right? So when we talk about having more renewable energy. Slightly more advanced companies are also focused on their supply chain. How can they reduce emissions along all of the products and services that actually affect their business? And there are many leading companies that are making their suppliers set science-based targets and really do a lot more internally to reduce emissions. What we're, though, focused on is that when it comes to really solving the climate crisis at scale, what we need is legislation, regulation, really big systemic changes to decarbonize the economy. And we call that scope 4 impact. So that the natural extension of those sort of sustainability priorities should include lobbying for climate. And Bill likes to say they need to lobby like they mean it. And, Bill was kind of, I can brag on Bill since he's not going to talk that much tonight. Bill's kind of a big deal. And he was a huge influence at Facebook and at Google, in addition to having great titles like Green Energy Czar. And he was frustrated that he couldn't get both those companies who both really, really care about climate to focus on lobbying, to focus on advocacy. And the reason they didn't do it is because they sort of saw risk. And as you know, climate is increasingly polarized in our country, and they didn't feel any pressure to get off the sidelines. So they were like, climate policy is messy and complicated, and we're just going to keep to our own lane. We're just going to narrowly focus on what we're doing. So when Build Back Better came out in September of last year, and the Biden administration and Congress was debating it, we in the climate community felt like this was the vehicle for really bold and ambitious climate policy in the US. And we were very disappointed that really good climate companies were not vocally endorsing this legislation. Now, granted, it was complicated legislation. There was lots to talk about. We'd love to talk to you about it. So what we decided to do was we wanted to be the accountability mechanism to really call these companies out on the difference between what they were saying about climate in their sustainability reports and all of their PR, and then what they were actually doing to help us pass meaningful legislation. So we created a scorecard and we called it Go Time because we were like, it's go time for climate. And we evaluated 20 companies who were already great on policy. And we said they had to fulfill 3 criteria. So one, did these companies endorse the actual climate policies in the Build Back Better Act? Did they support revenue provisions to pay for those policies? Because it was going to be impossible to execute on these if we didn't have some revenue to actually make them reality. And would that company actively oppose the negative lobbying by their own trade associations who were trying to kill this bill? So these were the 20 companies that we looked at because they were rated by Influence Map, which is a think tank that we collaborate with, as already having a track record on climate policy. And when we released our scorecard, 0 companies were leading. So basically, if you didn't meet any of our criteria, we considered you obstructing and gave you a red score. If you met 1 or 2 of the criteria, you got to be considered cautiously supporting this legislation. and you had to meet all 3 criteria to be considered leading. Now, the good news is we actually moved a bunch of companies from red to yellow. So we had, when we released the scorecard, we had more red than yellow, and now we have more yellow than red. But one of the things that we really wanted to do was to say, we need to frame what these companies aren't doing in a simple way that other audiences could hold them accountable. So one key audience for us is the workforce. So we shared the scorecard with employees and said, you need to raise your voice and ask your company why they're not supporting this legislation. And we know for sure that our scorecard got into the hands of employees who raised it at town hall meetings in front of executives. And they put those people on record and said, why aren't you doing this? We also shared our scorecard with the press. And the press was able, this Fast Company journalist actually called all 20 companies. And the headline sort of says it all. Why are these companies that claim to be so pro-climate not pushing this climate plan when it was called historic, once in a generation? Again, really meaningful provisions that are going to let us achieve the 2030 and 2050 goals that we need to hit. So we moved 7 companies to increase their support for the legislation, but we're still really working on how to move one of those companies to leading. Bill and I had off-the-record conversations with sustainability executives at almost all the yellow companies. And they said there's a lot of political dynamics inside their companies that make it hard for them to push things forward. But we feel like the really key issue is creating a durable movement among employees who expect their companies to do more on policy, and students who are going to ask companies hard questions when they interview for them, because those are the constituencies that can really bring the pressure to bear. And how do we know that this theory of change is going to work? Well, we take as our example LGBT equality. So as Kevin mentioned, I worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers before I joined ClimateVoice, and I, in the diversity space, really saw our employees, both LGBT employees and their allies, say it's great that PwC has all of these policies for us inside the company. So we offered same-sex domestic partner health benefits, for instance, in the 90s. But we want to see the firm take a stand on marriage equality. We want to see PwC and other companies that say they care about equality actually weigh into the debate of this moment, speak out against discriminatory legislation at the state level. And as you know, there were a lot of bold CEOs, including Mark Benioff at Salesforce, who said, I'm going to pull out of North Carolina if they pass more discriminatory bathroom bills. So this was the power of the voice of employees driving change from within, and we want to do the same for climate. So what would we like you to do? We have a petition that we've asked the general public and employees to sign that are really focused on the 5 biggest US tech companies. And we'd love you to sign it. And so we'll put it in the chat, but this is the link. And this is urging them to elevate climate as a top 5 advocacy priority, and to do that by saying they're going to invest more resources in it. We've done a lot of work with tech employees who feel very empowered, really care about climate, and want to see their companies stepping up. For our Go Time scorecard, we have pre-populated tweet buttons next to each company, where you can publicly ask leaders who are responsible for sustainability, their CEOs or board members who care about this topic, ask them to step up. The Senate, Build Back Better is not dead. It will probably not be called that. It's not going to be the exact bill that was introduced in September, but there's $555 billion worth of climate investments on the table. And we believe that if the CEOs of these companies stood up and said, this is important for society, for business, for all of us, we could actually see some progress in Washington on that. We'd love all of you to follow us on social media. We do a lot of educational events like this with groups like yours, but also events with thought leaders in the field. We just had a wonderful conversation on Twitter with Catherine Hayhoe, the climate scientist, who also happens to be an evangelical Christian, about how can we bridge the divides between people who believe in the climate and people who don't, and how do we get everybody sort of on board. And then if any of you know or are employees at these 20 companies, which is really the focus, our Go Time scorecard on the companies we're trying to influence, if you don't know any companies there who care about climate, please introduce them to us, invite them to meet us. We would love to work with them to build, again, a cadre of advisors and advocates who could really push for change from within. Again, companies have a huge role to play. And if the good guys, if the pro-climate companies cede the territory, then the dominant business voice in these debates are the fossil fuel companies and their allies, like their trade associations. One of the reasons that no one was green on our scorecard was none of the companies were willing to distance themselves from the negative lobbying of their own trade associations. The US Chamber of Commerce, for instance, spent millions of dollars to defeat Build Back Better, and they've been pretty successful. And you could see that in all of the media coverage. So this is Bill's email. We'd love you to keep in touch. And then with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we can go to questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was a great introduction. Really appreciate it. So we're going to get right into the conversation with Jennifer and Bill. I'd like to start with Bill, just talking a little bit about the origin story of ClimateVoice. Jennifer gave us some background, but maybe you can add some color to that, Bill.
Yeah, I started working on climate at Google in 2006. And at that point, I knew, not that much. I didn't know what I didn't know. I especially did not understand the policy world. And over the 12 years I was at Google and then Facebook, I really came to understand how useful the work that I and colleagues were doing in showing the way to scale clean energy, for example, and B, how it was woefully insufficient on its own, that to really get systemic change at the speed and scale we need systemic collective action. And I tried really hard to get my employers and other companies to lean in and support the kinds of public policies that would drive that. And most of the time, the answer was, we're going to stay on the sidelines. It's not our fight. And in the end, I concluded that I could have more impact on the outside by helping raise the expectation we all have for companies who want to be viewed as leading on climate.
I imagine that some of them were concerned about alienating some of their shareholders, which could affect the stock price. So yeah, it's scary probably for some of these corporations to take that leap. So what do you think accounts for the gap between what companies say they care about and, this is really a follow-up to that, and their action? Is it their share price, or is it something else?
So, go ahead. No.
I was just going to say, I think they see risk in speaking up. Some of them, it may be about the share price. I think in most cases, they're either worried about losing major customers like the fossil fuel companies, or they're worried about angering powerful politicians who can retaliate on them around regulatory issues that go to the core of their business.
And the only thing I would add to that, Kate, is I also think the incentives aren't there because, again, the climate policy fights are this long-term question and they're not being held accountable. So one of the things that we feel really strongly is particularly why we pick the companies that are already pro-climate, right? They're the good guys. We're not trying to take the terrible companies that don't care about climate or the fossil fuel companies that have direct interest against climate legislation. We're saying the people who want to get credit for saying, yes, we care about this. And in fact, the climate damage is going to be a materially negative issue for our business. We need the incentives to feel more urgent now. This sort of long-term, I can wait forever. We can just, debate this forever. We don't have to take immediate action is one of the really big problems. And so one of the questions in the chat was, how did the companies change who changed? And it was because this reporter called them. So we literally gave the reporter an embargoed copy of the scorecard on a Friday over a holiday weekend. And one of the companies on our list issued a rushed new statement supporting Build Back Better on that Monday. So we changed their color from red to yellow. So we know that that was a direct line. We know that there were 2 tech companies where our scorecard was introduced to a town hall meeting because we know it was directly linked to us. And executives, including in one of these instances, the CEO, was asked on the record in front of all the employees who attended this meeting, how come you tell us we're great on climate? How come we're not supporting this legislation? So I think those kinds of immediate actions and the employee voice really being raised in a more systemic way is what we're trying to do in terms of building a movement. If you care about climate, a lot of nonprofits are asking you to vote, for climate candidates, which is super important. If you're a student, a lot of, the student movement is asking you to strike for climate and protest. And what we're saying is if you're an employee and your company has a sustainability initiative, push them to lobby for climate, to do scope 4 impact, to use their influence on behalf of policy.
So really nobody is holding them accountable except perhaps the employees, the media, and voters.
Yeah.
Or customers and customers of those companies who can become lobbyists themselves.
There have definitely been a lot of groups trying to mobilize consumers. I think consumers are such a diffuse group. We started our work and the 1 in 5 petition was really around big tech companies because we felt like they had such reputations for being a force for good. It was such a big part of their brand that they wanted to solve social problems. So we sort of started there with them. And, for them, so many of them are monopolies. They're not that worried about their consumers. You're not going to give up your iPhone because Apple's not lobbying for policy. But if your employees say, we want you to do more, that would be meaningful.
Yeah. And somebody just pointed out in the chat that the boards of the companies can make a difference too in holding the companies accountable.
Yeah. Which is why there are board members in our Go Time pre-populated tweets. We have the handles of the people who care about climate at that company and who are the most influential.
So the Build Back Better plan is in limbo. And that obviously would have provided funding for clean energy, renewable energy, helping to modernize the electrical grid. Are there other ways to get this done? If Build Back Better is not going to go anywhere, do you see some other avenues for creating positive legislation?
At the federal level, in the near term, in terms of legislation, unlikely. I suppose there's a small chance of bipartisan legislation on climate, but I think that is a very long shot. I think the administration is going to continue doing everything it can through its executive authority, but that certainly isn't adequate. And then the other avenue is at the state level, which we need, honestly, regardless of what happens in DC, but strong policy in DC would make the state level stuff easier. And I should just say there are some states that really have been leading. New York, the state of Washington, and California, none are as far as they need to be, but they're way ahead of most other states in continuing to push forward.
Yeah. So there's been some talk of maybe pushing through some of these things on an individual basis through other bills or by renegotiating the Build Back Better plan, but still sounds like it's a ways off. So who can help? I mean, these are the big public companies. When is it appropriate to start talking to other companies who may not be as climate friendly as some of these? And what about very small companies or nonprofits? Are there, or individuals, are there roles for these people?
We would argue there's a role for everybody. It's all hands on deck. We are in an emergency. So we have one of our collaborators is Drawdown Labs, and they have, if you check out their website, they have a new link called the Climate Solutions Project. And basically what they're arguing is that every job's a climate job, and it's sort of ways in which you can figure out a climate lens on whatever it is you're doing in a company or a nonprofit or as an individual. And they have some really easy things that individuals can do. I think that the big shift we're trying to push is that sometimes individual responsibility has been reduced to like your own carbon footprint. So like, I should bike to work instead of driving a car. I should buy an electric vehicle. I should not eat meat. And those things are all good things to do. But when we talk about solving this crisis at scale, we need these bigger systemic solutions. So as an individual, I just think you have to think about how can you unlock those systemic answers. And that is about voting for climate candidates, because the gridlock at all levels of government are a real problem when it comes to climate policy. And then we're just trying to this new avenue, sort of a new angle, which is as an employee, how can you get your employer's influence focused on this problem?
Mm-hmm. But we don't want to just shift all the responsibility on the government. There's still, everybody still needs to play their part, as you said.
Yeah.
So can you give us some examples of companies that you've worked with, you know, what you do when you start this relationship with the company, what you say to them, who do you work with in the company, how do you motivate them?
Bill, do you want to start?
Sure. So we have talked with sustainability and public policy executives at most of these companies, and in most cases, multiple times. And we're really with them, encouraging them to aim high and really lean in and being clear about what we want and expect from them. And then we are talking with employees, not on the sustainability team, typically at many companies, and helping arm them with information they can use to reach out internally to their peers, to send letters from a group of employees to the CEO or the board, to meet with the chief sustainability officer, and so on.
And then the only thing I'd add to that is that we connect to employees a lot of different ways, but there's often now green teams and sustainability like networks within these companies of people who have already self-identified as interested in climate. And we try to come in and do talks like this. So if anybody wants to invite us to any of these companies, we'd love to come give a talk about why policy is such an important lever to solve the crisis. And then we also have a lot of people now that, again, we're trying to raise the bar for what constitutes climate leadership. So a lot of our media and our social media campaigns are around trying to reach employees and have them come share with us. We feel like it doesn't have to be a huge tipping point of employees. We need a few active people who can engage their peers internally. And the only thing that I want to mention that I didn't mention in my remarks is that we're really focused on employee advocacy. So employees saying, I love this company. I'm so proud to work here. I'm so glad that we care about climate. I want us to do more. So it's not really employee activism where we're not saying protest your company or say your company is terrible, because in fact, most of these pro-climate companies are doing great work in their operations. We just want them to step up and do more.
Are you monitoring whether that internal lobbying effort is working at these places?
So one of the questions in the chat too was about California lobbying. So the only lobbying that has to be disclosed that we can track in terms of through open secrets is at the federal level. If any of these companies lobby on like Build Back Better, we're doing an analysis right now to see how many of the 20 companies disclose that they lobbied on it. They have to, write it down and say how much money they spent. In California, you have to do the same. So we can measure California lobbying and federal lobbying, and we partner with Influence Map, which is a think tank that does a lot of this tracking for these 350 global companies. All other state lobbying doesn't have to be disclosed. So there's a lot of it where transparency is a real problem or lack of transparency. And obviously the other thing around disclosure that's interesting is you don't have to say whether you're lobbying for or against a bill. You just have to say you lobbied on it. So we can make some assumptions that the tech companies lobbied for Build Back Better and the oil companies lobbied against it, but they actually don't have to say that in their disclosure forms, which I always find puzzling.
Yeah, that's convenient. Well, that's really interesting. And what I'm also interested in is if you feel that the employees that you're empowering are doing the internal work that you've asked them to do. Bill's nodding.
Well, a lot of it actually starts, and then I'll let Bill jump in with find out what your company's position is on sustainability. So a lot of the employees that we've talked to, one of their first steps is reaching out to whoever's in charge of the function and having a private off the record meeting and saying, look, we really care about this. What are we doing? Could we be doing more? What are our positions? Where do we want to go? They meet together to educate themselves about the landscape in terms of what's happening. And that's, again, a lot of these Slack channels and webinars and other events that employees are bringing together. And then we've had some employees say, we want to write a letter to the board. We feel like our CEO isn't taking this seriously. And they, in a grassroots way, decided to write a letter to the board and got 400, fellow colleagues to sign it and sent it. And again, it's this drumbeat of actions and expectation that we feel like is going to lead to the long-term change.
That's awesome.
And that drumbeat is really key. It's rare that one or a bunch of employees raises with executives, and the executives say, "Oh, you're right, we should do that." The initial reaction is almost certainly going to be, "We consider this very carefully, and we're doing everything we can." And it takes persistence, and what we've seen in several companies, and what Jennifer and I both saw around LGBT rights, is that with repeated outreach, including sometimes employees going public, companies will move.
Oh. Do you see this expanding beyond other companies explicitly, like through your organization, other than the top 20 that you talked about?
Right now, our focus is that 20. Again, we're a pretty small startup, so we're trying to be as strategic as possible with our resources and our focus. We started with the 5 US tech companies because Bill had worked at 2 of them. So we felt like that was a really great place to start, both in terms of his standing and gravitas and relationships in those organizations. And then when we did the scorecard, we obviously wanted to extend it. And what was interesting is when we looked at the criteria of like who was a big US based company, that Influence Map had rated as high enough on their sort of scoring of climate policy advocacy, it just turned out to be 20. And so we thought, okay, this is the right list, and let's try to build a presence of those 20. So that's really what we're trying to do now this year.
That makes a lot of sense. So before we switch to the Q&A, I'd just like to repeat a quote that I saw Bill make on a May webinar that he did this past year, which is winning slowly. Winning slowly is the same as losing.
Damn straight. I am honestly, I think by nature, more of a glass half empty person, but how you respond emotionally to a situation like the climate crisis, we all have our own responses. They're all legitimate. Some people say we're winning, we just need to win faster. And I would agree, we need to win faster. But the pace at which we're winning now has us on a very dangerous course.
Well, thank you. I agree. I think that's a perfect place to start opening the questions. So Kevin's been compiling some questions that we're going to take on. So
yeah,
it's all yours, Kevin.
Thank you, Bill, Jennifer, and Kate. Yeah, I have a few questions here, and the first one is from Beth Gray. What prompted changes of the companies that were in the red to yellow?
Yeah, so as I mentioned a little bit earlier, because I saw that one, really, I feel like the pressure from the reporter. So we had 2 journalists, 2 big articles that covered our scorecard, and both reporters called all 20 companies, which was amazing for us because it really got their attention. And then we, again, shared the scorecard with our employees that we had developed relationships with, and they tried to raise it internally. And then Bill does a thing that we call trolling for climate. So if you follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn, you will see that anytime one of these 20 companies make an announcement about a great climate innovation or a product or a pledge or some philanthropic thing that they're doing, Bill's the first person in the queue publicly saying, that's great, sustainability executive. What about climate policy? And we have found that we can spread our message to their following very effectively by tracking them and holding them a little bit to a higher standard about what they're doing and what deserves applause.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. So another question is from Anna Dodson, 20. How can we encourage our companies from a brand product perspective to expand to scope 4? In terms of measuring the benefits in the climate report, I think there might be a barrier if the data points are more difficult to measure or aggregate. Is there a good way to measure scope 4?
Bill, I'm going to give that to you.
So our partner influence map really is the main organization that tracks every public statement, publicly available information about lobbying, ad campaigns, etc. They do it, I think, for about 350 of the world's biggest companies. And they have several metrics they use to quantify what position companies are espousing and how intensively they are using their influence to try to save and to change things. I think part of the problem in getting companies to do more is that it is complicated and subtle to measure, and there's little direct near-term benefit to the individual company for speaking up. So that's why we've been focused on educating their employees and also students as a labor pool they draw from for the next generation of employees to create a real advantage in recruiting and retention for companies that speak up.
Thank you, Bill. So next question is from our own Catherine. Are there other companies or organizations that do climate or other ESG scoring that you partner with?
We actually had a meeting with several companies that were standard setters. So the Climate Disclosure Project, GRI, there's a new values reporting institute that is trying to, again, measure both what companies are doing voluntarily and then what regulatory institutions like the SEC should be doing and should be requiring around disclosure. So I think there's a lot of talk about climate disclosure and about reporting. And what we tried to do with this group was to say, where is lobbying in your priority list? Because as Bill had to fill out the CDP questionnaire, it has many, many questions and takes an enormous amount of time and energy and resources to complete. So it wasn't that we wanted to add lots more questions. It was how do we incorporate lobbying and advocacy in a more transparent way? There's also a group of NGOs, and they created something called the AAA framework. And it's groups like the EDF and the World Resources Institute and the World Wildlife Foundation and other groups like that that came together and said what they really want companies to do is, advocate for policy, align their trade associations to make sure that the trade associations weren't in disagreement with those policies and that they could make change from within, and then also allocate more money and resources to advocacy. So those are the two big groups that we work with when it comes to like disclosures and pushing the ESG angle.
Thank you, Jennifer. This question from myself. I know every policy or the legislation policy is not going to be driven by one person. It's a group of people that support this. But if you have to single out some politician that is strong force in the climate change movement, who would that be that we can pay attention to that you know of?
Sheldon Whitehouse. Bill, is that who you're going to say?
There are a few, and we're certainly, as a nonprofit, we can't endorse candidates, but Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island has been a tireless advocate for climate policy. Jay Inslee in Washington, the governor, also a huge climate champion. And Evergreen Action, which actually was founded by a bunch of Inslee's climate people, is a think tank and advocacy organization that really, I think, has a great perspective on the range of policies we need.
And I just put Evergreen's website in the chat. And I think one of the great things they say about policy too is we need three things basically in policy. We need standards. So there have to be sort of standards for us. And, we talked about clean energy standards and other kinds of standards. There need to be investments. So that's where it comes like, electric vehicle infrastructure and some of the other investments. And then we need environmental justice. And those are all of the provisions, many of which are in Build Back Better around a just transition for both workers in the fossil fuel industry, and then also people who have been negatively impacted by the pollution, particularly marginal communities.
Wonderful. Great. So as I understand, we cannot sit on the sidelines anymore. Everyone should have this urgency to advocate by either signing petitions or support the candidates who's favorable to the climate change movement. We'll do whatever we have to do, even reduce our own carbon emission, by a little bit every day, and we should all do something. So thank you for the great information, raising awareness to all of us, and hopefully we all learned something today. So yeah, thank you, Bill and Jennifer. I think Kate, Catherine, I think our time's about to expire, and you two may take over. But I think we should give them both a chance to give a last word before you take over.
I just want to say thanks so much for having us. This was a pleasure and such great questions. And Anna from Apple, if you want to be in touch, please reach out. We'd love to talk to you. And again, it can be off the record, but thank you for your interest. And again, we do all need to be part of the solution.
I would echo all of that and encourage people, as you were saying, Kevin, do what you can within the scope of the things you control, your own footprint, but also think about all of the places where you perhaps with others have influence, because we need that systemic change, and that is going to take collective decisions, which really is about public policy.
Thank you so much, Bill and Jennifer, and thank you to all who attended today. As you know, we're recording this, and at some point in the near future, it'll be available for all to listen to, so you can start sharing it with your friends and your companies. And Catherine is going to wrap it up for us. You're on mute.
Unmute. Yeah. Okay.
Unmute. There we go.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Laurie. I'm president of the Dartmouth Alumni Association of Silicon Valley. And thank you all so much for joining us today and the great questions. I'd like to, of course, great thanks to Bill and Jennifer and their efforts with ClimateVoice. It's such important work. And hopefully, each of us will be able to kind of help move advocacy for the climate forward. And also I want to, of course, thank Kate and Kevin for helping to organize today's event. This is, again, a part of a series that we at the Dartmouth Alumni Association of Silicon Valley are putting on. So please do keep an eye out for our next event. We do them about quarterly, but more broadly, we do a variety of events, and hopefully in person again soon. We had one in-person event briefly, but then shut back down again. So if there are other events that would interest you, please do let me know. president@daasb.org is my email address. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you have a great afternoon and evening. Thanks.